So I left off part 1 with a mood disorder that's related to depression called bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression, and it includes cycling between depression episodes and manic episodes. And a manic episode, or mania, is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. So the person who's experiencing a manic phase or a manic period is a person who has inflated self-esteem. They have really little need for sleep. They talk excessively. They're very distractible. They have racing thoughts and ideas, and they have excessive involvement in pleasure-seeking activities. So originally, I was going to give you some examples of things that somebody in a manic episode would say. But I thought it would be more interesting if you actually saw him say the things himself. So here you go.
Charlie Sheen has got to be on drugs again.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I am on a drug. It's called Charlie Sheen. It's not available because if you try it once, you will die. Your face will melt off and your children will weep over your exploded body. Too much. So it's just I woke up and decided, I've been kicked around, I've been criticized, I've been like the aw shucks guy with like this bitch in rock star life, and I'm just finally going to completely embrace it, wrap both arms around it, and love it violently, and defend it violently through violent hatred. You're dealing with a Vatican assassin. Sorry. What does that mean, you're wondering? Whatever, it's just a joke. People take everything so literally. How about I tell them I'm a high priest, Vatican assassin warlock. I'm hippa, you know what I'm saying? Come on, man.
And what does that mean?
I don't know.
Where do these words come from, Charlie?
Those words that sound cool together. It comes from my grand wizard master. I don't know, man. Stuff just comes out, and it's entertaining, and it's fun, and it sounds different than all the other garbage people are spewing,
You have millions of fans.
I have billions of fans.
Billions of fans.
Sorry.
Tell me about the last time you took drugs.
Last time I took drugs, I probably took more than anybody could survive,
What are we talking about? How much?
I don't know, man. I was banging 7-gram rocks and finishing them because that's how I roll. I have one speed. I have one gear. Go.
How do you survive that?
Because I'm me. Because I'm me. I'm different. I just have a different constitution. I have a different brain. I have a different heart. I have a different, I get tiger blood, man.
You're proud of that party moment?
Of course. Why wouldn't I be?
Drugs?
No,
Why would you be?
Because I expose people to magic. I expose them to something they're never otherwise going to see in their boring, normal lives.
So that gives you an example of what an individual is like when they're in that manic phase. In bipolar disorder, the depression phase is the same as with regular depression. Now, regular depression has also been called unipolar depression. Bipolar disorder is much less common than depression, and it appears to be very strongly genetic. There's no sex differences in rates of bipolar disorder, so men and women develop this disorder relatively in equal rates. The most effective treatment so far has been lithium, and lithium is thought to act on the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. Lithium also appears to promote neurogenesis in the hippocampus, both hippocampi, of bipolar patients. One final note, it is possible to have unipolar mania, just like unipolar depression. So there is a cycle between manic episodes and periods of relatively normal mood. Here's an example of functional brain imaging for one person during a manic phase and that same individual during a depressed phase. So in this image, white indicates the greatest brain activity while blue indicates the lowest. So you can clearly see that during the manic phase, there appears to be hyperactivity in the brain compared to the depressed phase. Next, I'll be talking about anxiety and anxiety disorders. So anxiety is a strongly negative emotion, and it arises in the anticipation of a fearful or threatening stimulus. Now notice I said it arises in the anticipation of the stimulus, the fearful stimulus, because anxiety is not generated from fear of something that's real. And in fact, fear and anxiety are very different. Both of those emotions are very adaptive. They provide useful information that we need to avoid potentially harmful consequences like getting bitten by a snake. So we see a poisonous snake in the middle of a field, and suddenly we feel afraid, knowing it could potentially kill us. And that experience is the experience of fear, because there is an actual threat. You see the snake, and you experience the fear. So the next time we were in that field, near the place where we saw the snake, we'll begin to experience a similar fear a fearful feeling, but it isn't actually fear, because it's stemming from the idea that that snake could be lurking there again. The feeling that you're experiencing in this case is anxiety. Fear is very adaptive because it keeps us safe and out of harm from things that could potentially kill us or hurt us. And anxiety is also adaptive because it reminds us to avoid areas where there are creatures and things that are potentially very harmful to us. Even though anxiety sometimes is an emotion that is uncomfortable to feel, we would be unable to survive without ever experiencing anxiety. When I was choosing a picture of snakes to put on this slide, I was experiencing that anxiety because they're scary and they're something you really do want to avoid. However, excessive, overwhelming, or unrealistic anxiety, such as that experienced by people with anxiety disorders, can be very detrimental. So anxiety disorders are more common than depression. In fact, approximately 30% of the population will experience an anxiety disorder during their lifetime. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that anxiety disorders affect 40 million Americans each year. So there are several different anxiety disorders, and I won't cover all of them. The most common in the United States are generalized anxiety disorder, and that's where an individual feels extreme anxiety and worry that appears to pervade that person's entire life. And it doesn't seem to relate to any just one particular thing. People with this kind of anxiety disorder feel anxious just getting through the day. Obsessive compulsive disorder is another anxiety disorder, but this disorder includes compulsive thoughts and then rituals that attempt to calm or quell that anxiety that those thoughts create. Unfortunately, those rituals rarely provide any relief from that anxiety, and the cycle of the compulsive thoughts and the ritual behavior continues. Panic disorder is another common anxiety disorder, and it results in an overwhelming sense of crisis that causes the sympathetic nervous system to activate itself into overdrive to the extent that the person feels extreme and paralyzing fear. So this often includes a physical reaction that can even feel like having a heart attack. Panic attacks are one aspect of panic disorder. Panic disorder can be so debilitating that people become afraid to leave their homes because they're afraid that they will experience that overwhelming sense of panic or have a panic attack. Social anxiety disorder, or social phobia, is a strong fear of being judged by other people and feelings of embarrassment, or the potential that you will feel very embarrassed by judgment of other people. This anxiety is experienced not just when you're in a social situation, but when you think about a social situation, often for days or weeks before you're even in that situation. So this is another disorder that is often so severe, it prevents people from doing their regular activities of going to school or work or socializing. The last anxiety disorder that I'll talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is extreme anxiety that stems directly from the experience of a physical or emotional trauma. Now, who ends up suffering from anxiety disorders? Well, there appears to be a strong link to the genes. Although it's not specific for each of the disorders, this predisposition is for experiencing an anxiety disorder in general, rather than one of those specific subtypes. And families who have a stronger predisposition for these disorders are the same families who are predisposed to developing depression. Anxiety and depression are correlated, and they may share similar underlying genetics. Although anxiety and depression don't always occur together, and they don't always occur to the same extent. There are sex differences in anxiety disorders. Women are diagnosed with anxiety disorders more often than men for all of the anxiety disorders except for social anxiety or social phobia. For social anxiety disorder, men and women have similar rates of the disorder. So how does anxiety happen? Well, fear and anxiety are two different things, as I mentioned. And fear is an emotional response to an actual threat or danger in the environment. Anxiety, on the other hand, is an emotional response to the anticipation of danger or threat. Robert Sapolsky argues that most things we become anxious about, other than things that are innate, like falling or snakes or spiders or being suffocated, are learned. So going to the dentist, for example, includes hearing that awful aversive drilling noise, and sometimes that includes pain if you have to have the drill used on you. There's the smells and the sounds. And so when you're at the dentist, you experience the autonomic arousal of having the drill in your mouth and potentially feeling any pain. And the thoughts of the dentist become paired with that autonomic experience of going to the dentist and sitting in the chair and hearing and experiencing the drill and all of the other nervous system activation that goes along with the dentist visit. So you leave the dentist, but the next time you think of the dentist, this learned association creates this feeling of discomfort or anxiety, including all that sympathetic nervous system arousal that you experienced while you were there. And whenever the subject of the dentist is brought up, you experience those feelings, those autonomic nervous system responses, and that anticipation of that discomfort. It's no wonder that there's an urban legend that dentists have the highest suicide rate of professionals when just thinking about them makes a person feel bad. Anxiety disorders are a result of cognitive distortion. So they're similar to depression in that sense. It's the idea that a situation or an object is far more dangerous or threatening than it really is. The danger or threat becomes grossly overestimated, and even when the person is cognitively aware that their thinking on this is distorted, they still can't stop that feeling, that dread feeling of anxiety. So what is the cause of anxiety disorders? Everyone experiences anxiety, but why is anxiety more manageable for some and not others? So anxiety and a predisposition to experiencing anxiety disorders may be related to activity in the GABA receptors. So if you recall, GABA is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and a class of drugs called benzodiazepines increases the sensitivity of those GABA receptors. Those GABA receptors are all over the brain, in the cortex, also in the hippocampus and the amygdala. Increasing the sensitivity of those receptors then increases the amount of GABA that the brain can use, and as a result, it increases inhibition, which actually reduces the experience of anxiety. That is why these drugs, the benzodiazepines, which include Valium and Xanax, to name a couple, are commonly given to people with anxiety because they have a calming and sedating effect because they inhibit. This connection between anxiety and GABA receptors has led to the hypothesis that anxiety may be related to a deficit in GABA receptors. Anxiety has also been related to other neurotransmitter levels in the brain. For example, serotonin. There's some evidence that excessively anxious people may have low activity of serotonin synapses. And when people with anxiety disorders are given SSRIs, which increase the amount of serotonin in the synapses, it reduces their anxiety. So there's the hypothesis that low serotonin is what creates anxiety. So more recently, another potential neurotransmitter has been proposed as a factor in developing anxiety disorders. And this one is glutamate. So recent research has investigated glutamate as being a master switch that is important in changing neural connections in the brain. So stress, especially chronic stress, appears to dramatically increase glutamate release in the limbic system, and studies show that large increases of glutamate in the limbic system as a result of stress can deteriorate the limbic system structures. This deterioration can lead to disruptions and faulty communication between limbic system circuits. And also, it's believed that it's the disruptions in the connections and in the circuits of the limbic system that lead to mental illness, such as anxiety disorders. Add this to the evidence that chronic stress is strongly related to anxiety disorders, and it's been suggested that stress may lay the groundwork for anxiety disorders to occur. Having excess glutamate damaging the limbic system and disrupting those circuits may be one of the reasons why anxiety disorders happen. And let's not forget that chronically experienced anxiety also evokes huge amounts of stress on the body. So it becomes a vicious feedback cycle of stress leading to anxiety, which in turn can lead to more stress. Remember, in the HPA axis, anxiety can feed on itself when the sympathetic nervous system arousal feeds back on the amygdala, and the amygdala reacts to that high level of sympathetic nervous system arousal. It may be that when anxiety starts to feed on itself, for people that are predisposed to anxiety disorders, there are disruptions in the connections in place For example, the frontal lobe, which can inhibit sympathetic nervous system response, may be less able to inhibit the stress response or to calm it down. And this is consistent with many studies that indicate that chronic stress predisposes a person for anxiety disorders. It may be that stress-related increases in glutamate do enough damage to create the perfect conditions for an anxiety disorder to happen. And along this line, very recent studies show that drugs that alter glutamate processes can greatly reduce anxiety and the experience of anxiety disorders. So the one anxiety disorder that I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about is PTSD. And PTSD is unfortunately becoming more and more common and more of a social issue as a result of soldiers returning from war. But it's not only soldiers who are affected. A person can develop PTSD after witnessing an intense or especially traumatic or awful event, including abusive violence and or death, such as sudden death of a close friend, rape, torture, kidnapping. So in PTSD, memories of the horrible events intrude into consciousness and produce those same visceral feelings of arousal, that extreme fear, the trembling, that massive autonomic sympathetic nervous system activation that the original event caused. These memories are cued during stressful situations and even by harmless stimuli in the environment that sound similar or look similar or smell similar to those conditions involved in the traumatic event. And as a result, a person with PTSD eventually becomes hypervigilant, ever watchful, and easily fearful. This has also been called shell shock or combat fatigue. It's estimated that at least a third of all veterans suffer from PTSD, and sadly, many never obtain treatment. Other symptoms of PTSD, other than the emotional hypervigilance and overarousal, are memory loss, such as amnesia for some aspects of the traumatic event or the events, flashbacks, and short-term memory loss. There are also physical effects on the brain as well. So the memory deficits that occur with PTSD suggest that the hippocampus is involved in this disorder, and this is what researchers have found. Those with PTSD tend to have a smaller right hippocampus. You can see the hippocampus is outlined in red in these two pictures. The individual who does not have PTSD is on the left, and the individual with PTSD is on the right. Notice the volume is smaller. In addition to these volume differences, it's also apparent from studies that the activation of the hippocampus in response to stimuli that are fearful, like fearful faces, is also different for PTSD sufferers. PTSD sufferers show lower activation in the amygdala. So, however, these results are somewhat inconclusive because twin studies have shown that the smaller hippocampal volume for people with PTSD may have actually existed prior to the traumatic experience and prior to the development of PTSD. And so if that's the case, one interpretation could be that a smaller hippocampus will predispose you to getting PTSD if exposed to a traumatic event. So one of the models for the development of PTSD is that it develops as a result of fear conditioning and something that goes awry in fear conditioning. So during the stress response, the amygdala alerts the HPA axis. The hypothalamus signals to the brainstem to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system then is active. It releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. At the same time, the hypothalamus alerts the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which travels to the adrenal glands, where after a short period of time it starts releasing glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. Now, glucocorticoids do different things in the body that we've talked about during the stress response, but one of the things that they do is they bind with receptors in the hippocampus, and that allows the enhancement of the consolidation of memories with emotion. And in the case of PTSD, this is where the memory consolidation is thought to go wrong. So it's in the binding of the glucocorticoids to receptors in the hippocampus that usually helps us enhance a memory by combining the emotional feedback from the body and the amygdala with the traumatic event that impairment happens. So the fear and the extreme trauma that happened during the event gets somehow attached to all kinds of other stuff related to that event, like the situation or the environment or the sounds or the smells, to the same degree that it is related to the actual traumatic event. Now, this is something called hyperamnesia. Hyperamnesia is an impairment in memory, and it's similar to amnesia, but instead of the inability to remember, the hyperamnesia involved in PTSD is when everything about the event is remembered, even the unimportant things. It's when everything about a traumatic event is remembered and attached with that same fear and extreme terror and trauma that the actual traumatic event elicited. So recent research has indicated that the use of beta blockers and other medications that reduce that bodily arousal, that autonomic nervous system activity, within a few hours after a traumatic event, show promise in reducing the potential of developing PTSD. So somehow blocking the stress response, blocking the sympathetic nervous system, allows the amygdala and the hippocampus to properly combine the emotional significance of the traumatic event without including all of the irrelevant details that are usually included in PTSD and that elicit extreme emotional reactions, fear, terror, whenever anything cues those details. So it's thought that one of the reasons for this is because memory is enhanced during consolidation by the state of your body, your autonomic arousal, that feedback that you get. And that feedback, that arousal, is important information that the hippocampus puts into the memory so that we can keep track of that for later if that ever comes up again. The problem in hyperamnesia is that many things that are unrelated but were present during the traumatic event, tend to also be associated with and have that same emotional significance as the traumatic event itself did. So there's this inability to parse out the important aspect of the trauma, the traumatic event itself, with the unimportant details that surrounded the trauma, because the emotional fear and bodily reaction is attached to everything rather than just that one event. And this is thought to be a result of this infusion, this massive infusion of glucocorticoids that happens during the stress response to a really traumatic event. Somehow, the binding of the glucocorticoids with the hippocampus results in memory consolidation that makes it very difficult to identify the correct source of the threat. And what ends up happening is that any cue that reminds the person of that traumatic memory, even if it's something that's very distant or peripheral to the event, evokes that emotional fear and extreme response. And that's the end of this lecture.